Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Acton. I am a registered doctoral psychologist in the province of Saskatchewan. Formerly, I worked for the Acquired Brain Injury Partnership Project, carrying out behavioral interventions, providing neuropsychological assessments, and doing a degree of case management. In this module of the Introduction to Acquired Brain Injury, I will be talking to you about behavioral interventions. We will begin by putting forward a model of how the workings of the brain, the effects of brain injury, and behavior are linked. This model is to help us understand how we need to modify behavioral intervention work when working with individuals after a brain injury. We will then talk about basic behavioral intervention methodology as it's been traditionally practiced. We will go on to talk about more recent innovations in behavioral interventions. And we will finish by talking about how, in particular ways, we need to use our brain injury lens to understand and work with individuals with behavioral difficulties. The particular framework that we want to adopt when trying to do behavioral work with people after acquired brain injury is a neurobehavioral perspective. The quote on your screen does an excellent job of summarizing what it is that we're talking about. Basically, we are looking at a way of thinking about how the person behaves and learns as a result of the injury. That is, how is the behavior of the person and their learning either affected by or constrained in some way by the injury itself. When we use a model like this, we are looking at the behavior and learning in a certain way. We are starting with the brain and what it usually does. We are looking at the injury and how that affects what the brain is capable of, and then looking to see that final link to behavior in terms of how the brain, affected by the injury, leads to the behavior that we see. There are a number of very important things that this way of looking at behavior after brain injury works. One is, it suggests unusual cues for the behavior that we're seeing. In behavioral terminology, we call these antecedents. Antecedents are basically triggers that precede the occurrence of the behavior. After brain injury, some of the things that trigger behavior are directly related to that brain injury behavior link and give us a novel view on why the behavior is happening. Knowing the brain injury behavior link also gives us a sense of why certain things we do to produce desired behaviors may not be working well. Oftentimes we try to get the behavior we want to see by cueing the individual, or we change stimuli, that is, the things that we hope will lead to certain behavior. Understanding what the impact of injury is on the brain and on learning can help us to see why our usual approaches might not be producing the results that we want. The brain injury behavior also helps us to understand the learning of the individual that we're working with. A significant impact for many people after acquired brain injury is in the area of memory. Individuals after brain injury can have both the total capacity or magnitude of their memory affected, so that they learn more slowly and can only take in certain amounts of information. But it also tells us about the way in which they learn or remember. That is, certain individuals might have their ability to remember based on things that are said to them grossly change after an injury, while others, that modality is intact, but they have trouble learning by doing. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, and that the brain injury behavior link provides insight to, is how behavior that we don't want to see may be being reinforced in an accidental way. If we don't understand what the survivor's experience is, we may be doing things that actually give them a benefit or somehow reward them for the behavior that they're doing without really appreciating that we're doing it. So in summary, having that brain injury behavior link in our mind and understanding what the impact could be helps us to see the world through the survivor's experience and helps us to understand why the things we are doing might not be working the way that we expect them to, and how the individual may need us to act or respond in order for them to learn. Below is a drawing that tries to illustrate how the neurobehavioral model works. At the top of our little drawing is environmental contingencies and stimuli. This is where our model starts. Simply said, environmental contingencies and stimuli are the things that happen in the world around all of us that tend to be cues or triggers for our behavior and tend to reward or punish what we do. Contingencies are simply those things that happened as a consequence to the behavior that we engage in. So, for example, if we are walking into our home and one of our children looks up and smiles at us and says, "Hi," right? We're cued to go over and give them a hug, ask them how their day was going, and when they excitedly tell us what's happening, we are rewarded for doing that behavior. In our model, we can see that environmental contingencies and stimuli lead to 3 changes that may happen to the brain and brain functioning after an injury. One of these is cognitive deficits. Right? Cognitive deficits involve parts of the brain that carried out cognitive functions. They could be memory functions, they could be language, they could be about self-control. These are the deficits that we might see and serve as a filter through which the individual after brain injury experiences and can work with the environmental contingencies and stimuli. Altered motivational status is also something that can be an intervener between the environment and what happens for the person. Altered motivational status just refers to states that the individual gets into after their injury that may affect their ability to either control impulses or motivate themselves to do things. Many individuals who survive a brain injury can have their lives affected by the fact that they no longer control the things that they say to the same degree, or the actions that they carry out, or that they cannot find the wherewithal to follow through on desires and wishes, both within themselves and those coming from others. Finally, brain injuries can lead to emotional dysregulation. The brain has basic centers that both drive emotions and contain emotions. In a typically functioning individual, these systems balance off so that the individual can express emotion when they need to and can inhibit or control the expression of their emotion when they need to. In individuals after brain injury, one of the outcomes can be either disinhibition, because the part of the brain that controls emotions is damaged, or overactivity within the centers that create emotion. As you can see, all of these areas in which the brain is altered after an injury can provide a filter through which what happens in the world around you is either misunderstood, overreacted to, or in other ways responded to in ways that the individual would not typically have done prior to their injury. Our next set of arrows show what happens as the environmental contingencies and stimuli flow through the changes in cognition, the motivational changes, and the difficulties with emotion. The cognitive deficits, as noted, lead to particular changes in the individual's capacity to respond to the environment. It can lead to slow or impaired learning of contingencies. Basically, what used to reinforce or punish something and lead to changes in behavior are affected so that the impact of these changes happen more slowly. So an individual who might have learned relatively quickly, if you said, when talking with my uncle, you need to watch your language, he's very sensitive to that. And you use a series of stares or nudges to reinforce your partner in not using that kind of language. The individual with cognitive deficits, particularly in the area of learning, may take a long time to be able to change their behavior so they don't do it in front of this person. Another important thing to see is that the impact of the cognitive changes may reduce the person's ability to even recognize the stimuli. This can come in the form of simply less ability to attend to the world around them, so they actually miss cues that others would find very evident or readily seen or understood. Right? But they also may have specific deficits that do not allow them to see the stimuli. Some individuals after their injuries have perceptual impairments that are so great that they cannot appreciate what it is that they're feeling in their hands, seeing before them, or hearing. Another way in which cognitive deficits come in is in terms of the flexibility of responding. An intact brain is able to move in a very flexible way based on what it's perceiving, what its understanding of past things is, its ability to remember what's going on and what has happened in the past, and to come up with new ways in the moment of dealing with what's happening. That flexibility is often lost in the individual after brain injury. If we slip over and look at what happens as our contingencies and stimuli are filtered through the altered motivational status, what we note is that there are changes that lead to what we call performance deficits or excesses. These deficits aren't in keeping with environmental demands. In these situations, what we find is that the motivational state within the individual is so disconnected from the world around them that they appear to be responding in inappropriate ways. For example, they might be hungry, but take no action to feed themselves, even though they're capable of it. Most common after a brain insult or illness are performance deficits. The brain needs a certain amount of intact connections for it to move forward. However, if the regions of the brain that provide control over behavior are damaged, then we can get excesses in behavior. Individuals who are doing far more of certain behaviors than they would have in the past, because those parts of their brain would have said, not now, do this later, this is not a good thing to do. Finally, if we look at how the environmental factors are filtered through emotional dysregulation, what we find is that we often get a high level of reactivity to what's happening around. Individuals after a brain injury can have real difficulties just containing their emotional responses to things. Sometimes this is very brain driven. So there are individuals who talk about simply crying for no particular reason. There is no stimuli, there's nothing going on around them. This just comes out of them as if a tap has been turned on. However, for most individuals, it is simply that they have less control over those emotions. They're more likely to be anxious or angry or sad, or they have less control over these things, these emotions, when they are exposed to the environment in certain ways. Finally, as we follow our arrows to the bottom of our figure, we see that the impact of what's happening around the individual filtered through the changes to the brain, leading to changes in ability, come to a final common pathway, which we will call conduct problems. Notice I am using the word conduct problems, not behavior problems. We'll explain what behavior is later. I use the term conduct problems because the difficulties we run into are usually because the individual is not conducting themselves the way we expect them to. And it is leading to some kind of difficulties, either in terms of the execution of their tasks of daily living and taking care of themselves, or, and this is often, I would say actually more often the case, difficulties interacting with others around them. And these difficulties with others can come out in terms of a work placement, or being out with friends, or being home with family, or even interacting with professionals around them. So as we see, in summary, we have the typical contingencies and stimuli, the things around all of us that we all react to, that are filtered through the changes to the brain as a result of the injury, which are manifest in different kinds of deficits or excesses, either in terms of cognition, motivation, or emotion, and these lead all together to difficulties with conduct.